2:14 a.m., early morning of December 12, 2025, Kupiansk direction. A sunken corridor wedged between two tree lines opens along a dirt road axis parallel to a drainage ditch right at the edge of a small village cluster. The terrain is low enough to evade daytime observation, narrow enough to force the formation to cling to the axis. On the Ukrainian UAV team's tablet, the infrared feed is unusually clean. No muzzle flashes, no smoke trails, no clear jamming signals. Infantry slides down first, light armor following at a distance of 80 to 120 meters. The spacing tightens with the terrain. In the distance, Russian high ground remains silent for an extended stretch. Not silent because it is empty, but silent like it is waiting. 2:17 a.m., the first adjustment salvo slices across the night sky, and in that exact moment, the rear door of the corridor begins to close, from 2:14 to 2:24 a.m. The early morning of December 12, 2025, Ukraine treats the darkness as a 10-minute window, a risk gap before Russian firepower can fully come online. By day, Russian UAVs track closely and artillery adjusts by the minute. At night, there is a rare chance to move fast before the opponent reacts. The plan is very simple. Move fast, move tight, and move deep enough before Russian firepower activates. Shark and Lelika 100 reconnaissance UAVs fly ahead roughly 2 to 4 kilometers, scanning the forward line. No muzzle flashes, no artillery smoke trails, no probing harassment fire. On the ground, the mechanized formation hugs the dirt road beside the drainage ditch. Maintaining 80 to 120 meters of spacing, speed around 12 to 18 kilometers per hour. Communications are compressed to the minimum. Short coordinate bursts, limited speech, mesh radios to prevent total network collapse if one vehicle goes down. But that very quiet 10 minutes is the anomaly. The Russian forward line is not just silent, but silent with structure. A few thermal points on the high ground flicker on and off exactly as the UAV sweeps past. The sunken corridor opens too neatly, too perfectly timed. If Russia is waiting for the formation to sink deep enough before sealing the return route with 152 and 122 millimeter artillery alongside BM-21 Grad, then the first 10 minutes are not an opportunity. They are the lead-in to a trap. After 2:18 a.m., the Ukrainian formation begins advancing into the sunken corridor toward Kupiansk under what are considered the most favorable conditions of the night so far. Shark and Lelika 100 reconnaissance UAVs fly 2 to 3 kilometers ahead, scanning along the edges of the two tree lines. The infrared feed is nearly empty. No muzzle flashes, no artillery smoke trails, no repeating thermal cycles. The Russian forward line is completely silent. Around 2:25 a.m., the infantry spearhead contacts a scattered mine belt at the mouth of the corridor. Engineers open a 3 to 5 meter gap, enough for vehicles to pass one by one. Infrared guide markers are activated for only a few seconds, then switched off to avoid exposing the crossing point. Immediately after, light armored vehicles begin sliding down into the low ground. Stryker, M113 APCs, and MRAPs follow the dirt road axis parallel to the drainage ditch, maintaining 80 to 120 meters of spacing, speed 12 to 18 kilometers per hour. No vehicle stops, no vehicle overtakes. From the Ukrainian side, the empty space ahead at this moment looks very real. But as the last vehicles slip into the basin, the corridor has already closed geometrically behind them, silently and exactly on its waiting rhythm. After 2:33 a.m., Russian silence ends in the most uncomfortable way possible. No warning shots, no familiar knock on the door. Just a single adjustment beat landing right at the mouth of the corridor, directly behind the last vehicle. 1 to 2 salvos, clean and precise, like sliding a bolt into place. The objective is not immediate destruction. The objective is to lock the return route. In a sunken corridor, losing the way back means losing the right to choose tempo. From that moment on, the Ukrainian formation no longer operates on its original plan, but begins to be dragged into the opponent's fire cycle. From 2:35 to 2:37 a.m., firepower ramps up in layers. 152 mm and 122 mm tube artillery fire, short rhythms into the basin, forcing vehicles to brake, to evade, to cling tightly to the dirt road axis parallel to the drainage ditch. Immediately after, BM-21 Grad and Tornado G pick up the rhythm with cross-cutting salvos. This is not saturation fire. This is geometric fire. One blocking strip to the rear to seal retreat. One chopping strip in the middle to create congestion. One sealing strip at the exit so the formation cannot break out of the low ground. The corridor that was once a sneak-through shifts into a jammed pipe. Each salvo that lands does not just create craters, but adds a new constraint to every decision. The breaking point does not require a massive explosion. It only takes one hard break. It only takes a vehicle like a Striker or an M113 stopping for a few dozen seconds to avoid an artillery crater. At that moment, the 80 to 120 meter spacing begins to collapse. Vehicles behind do not dare to spread out in the dark, do not dare to overtake with tree lines on both sides and sunken terrain, so the entire cluster compresses by instinct. One slow vehicle pulls two slow vehicles. Two slow vehicles pull a cluster, and that cluster turns itself into a choke point. Rounds do not need to chase the formation. The formation pulls itself into the jam, then sinks deeper into it with each falling beat. Only when the corridor has been fully framed shut do Russian UAVs appear as a second locking layer. Orlan 10 and Supercam climb from behind the high ground. They do not need to hunt individual vehicles. They only need to confirm which clusters have compressed. Just 2 to 4 minutes of observation from above is enough, because every time vehicles stop for 20 to 40 seconds after an artillery salvo, heat pools on infrared like red embers gathered into a pile. And when a cluster clings to the dirt road parallel to the drainage ditch, its direction of movement becomes almost predictable. Immediately afterward, electronic warfare comes online at exactly the threshold, exactly when the formation needs command the most. Not to blind the entire sky, only selective jamming against the main communications route. Dropping data packets, pushing signals onto backup paths. The result is coordinates arriving 30 to 60 seconds late. It sounds small, but inside a corridor being cut, 30 seconds is a lethal loss of rhythm. Orders to split clusters arrive when the cluster is already jammed. Orders to maintain spacing arrive when spacing has already collapsed. Orders to change direction arrive when artillery craters have already bent the axis. By this point, Ukraine understands it is not just being fired upon. It is being tempo-controlled. The initial silence was not an empty space. It was the opening act of a trap, waiting for the formation to sink deep enough to lock the route. Cut it into 3 segments, then use BM-21 Grad Tornado G reconnaissance UAVs and selective jamming to turn darkness into a lid closing precisely over that axis. When the lid shuts, the battlefield is no longer wide. It contracts into a narrow tube where every passing second becomes a test. Stop and be locked, push forward and run into fire strips, turn back and find no road. And only one thing maintains rhythm from start to finish: firepower. After around 2:40 a.m., once artillery has firmly locked the sunken corridor and the Ukrainian formation is held in the low ground, Russia no longer needs to increase density of fire. Artillery continues to fall at a steady pace, short rhythms, just enough to force every vehicle to keep its head down and not dare to remain stationary for long. At this stage, artillery is no longer firing to destroy as much as possible. It fires to maintain pressure, maintain tempo, forcing the formation to react continuously, like running through a narrow passage with the rear door already blocked. And precisely within that rhythm, attack UAVs are brought in. FPVs and Lancets, the loitering drones that dive into targets and detonate, do not hunt for the largest vehicles. They hunt for what still allows the formation to function: engineering vehicles and recovery trucks trapped in the middle of the corridor. In a space constricted by drainage ditches, tree lines, and artillery lanes already laid down by geometry, losing recovery vehicles means losing the ability to correct mistakes. One disabled vehicle at the front is no longer a temporary incident. It becomes a fixed obstacle, and every vehicle behind it begins to pay the price. By around 2:43 a.m., the chain reaction becomes visible. Vehicles that had previously maintained spacing of 80 to 120 meters are forced to brake to avoid artillery craters or stalled vehicles. Within a few dozen seconds, spacing collapses to 20 to 40 meters. Vehicles behind do not dare to spread out because of darkness, because of fear of losing formation, and because communications begin to flicker. The formation does not compress due to orders, it compresses by instinct. And once compressed, on infrared cameras, the entire vehicle cluster appears far more clearly, like multiple heat spots gathered into a single bright mass. Artillery still does not need to intensify, it only needs to fall at the right moments. Each salvo forces the formation to stop. Each stop allows heat to accumulate. Each accumulation of heat allows reconnaissance drones to confirm targets with a glance. There is no need to loiter for long, no need to search in circles. Looking into the basin alone is enough to identify which targets are stuck, which are compressing, and which will remain stationary for another few dozen seconds. And immediately after the formation has exposed itself on infrared, Russia strikes the remaining tempo anchor communications. Around 2:46 a.m., several FPVs are tasked onto command vehicles or antenna-bearing platforms inside the corridor. They do not need to create a massive explosion. They only need to silence them. With selective jamming already active, losing a single relay point is enough to fragment the formation. Orders still arrive, but they arrive late. And inside a corridor that has already been cut, a late order is a wrong order. From that moment on, the Ukrainian formation is no longer an attacking spearhead. It becomes multiple clusters improvising on their own. With artillery maintaining tempo and drones observing from above, the most realistic option left is withdrawal in small clusters of 2 to 3 vehicles, exploiting brief gaps between artillery salvos to escape the corridor. The clusters separate by 60 to 90 seconds, not to maintain formation, but to avoid turning themselves into dense targets. Vehicles trapped farther back are no longer recovered. Vehicles are abandoned. The axis of advance is erased. Priority shifts entirely to preserving personnel, and that is the end point of this night. Not a massive explosion, but the moment you realize that tempo has broken, recovery capacity is gone, communications arrive too late, and every minute spent stationary makes the situation worse than the minute before. Russia does not need a loud finishing strike. They only need to remove the one thing that allows the opponent to function. Once tempo is taken away, what remains is inertia. And inertia inside a narrow corridor always leads to the same outcome. Breakthrough dissolves. Withdrawal fragments under controlled fire. As the bursts thin out, what is revealed is not how many vehicles burned, but how a breakthrough spearhead can be broken with very cheap moves that hit the nerve. Russia does not win with a single blow. They win by keeping artillery at just enough to lock the corridor, then using suicide drones to strike straight at the recovery vehicles. Once that rescue hand is cut, spacing collapses from 80 to 120 meters to 20 to 40 meters. The vehicle cluster compresses, and the infrared signature thickens immediately. Once everything is dense on the screen, they then hit antennas and command vehicles so the coordination tempo snaps completely. In a matter of minutes, Ukraine's night movement advantage flips. Darkness no longer conceals. It only makes it harder for the formation to correct mistakes inside a corridor already measured in advance. And when communications are delayed by 30 to 60 seconds, even the right order becomes an order that arrives too late. At that point, clusters have no choice but to withdraw, separated by 60 to 90 seconds, so they do not turn themselves into a dense target. The lesson is concrete. To break through at night and survive, you need a fallback route outside the corridor. You need a way to force the opponent's high ground to go silent with timely counter-battery fire, and you need a minimal command channel that still runs under jamming. Without those three things, the opponent's silence is not empty space. It is the sign you are walking into a trap already calculated. Night does not erase sensors. It only changes the dominator. Infrared, drones, and artillery firing on pre-prepared coordinates instead of direct human eyesight. In the Kupiansk direction, Ukraine's problem is not moving in the dark. The problem is that they read darkness as cover, while the other side reads it as a tempo to lock the door behind them. The remaining question is blunt. If a sunken corridor can be locked with only a few adjustment salvos, a few rocket artillery strips, and a beat of selective jamming, is breakthrough still a problem of speed anymore, or has it become a problem of tempo? Who brings fire online at the right moment? Who cuts the right operating node first? And who makes the opponent understand too late?